Ignored at her husband's hospital event, she signs the papers, unaware the donor was the Mafia boss. The crystal chandeliers of Boston General's grand ballroom cast fragments of light across 300 guests in evening wear, but none of that light seemed to reach the woman standing alone near the service entrance. Clara Mitchell adjusted the strap of her modest black dress, the same one she had worn to every hospital function for the past 4 years, and watched her husband work the room, like a politician running for office. Dr. Richard Mitchell, chief of cardiology, moved from table to table with his practiced smile, his hand resting casually on the small of his colleague's back, a woman Clara had never seen before tonight. She was young, blonde, confident in a red dress that cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe. Clara pressed her back against the cold marble pillar and reminded herself to breathe. This was supposed to be the night everything changed. Richard had promised. After 12 years of marriage, after supporting him through medical school, through residency, through the endless nights alone while he built his career, he had promised that tonight she would finally stand beside him. Tonight, at the announcement of the new cardiac wing donor, she would be introduced as his wife, his partner, the woman who had sacrificed everything so he could become the man he was. But the evening had begun with Richard checking his phone in the car, telling her to find her own way inside because he needed to handle something urgent. It continued with her standing at the entrance alone, no one acknowledging her presence, no one offering her a glass of champagne or directing her to their table. She had wandered the periphery of the ballroom for nearly an hour now, invisible among the glittering crowd. The clinking of a spoon against glass silenced the room. Clara looked up to see Dr. Harrison Wells, the hospital administrator, taking the podium at the front of the ballroom. Behind him, a large screen displayed the architectural rendering of the new Mitchell Cardiac Center, named after her husband, despite the fact that Richard had not contributed a single dollar to its construction. That honor, Clara knew, belonged to an anonymous donor who had given $15 million on one condition, that the wing be named after the surgeon who would lead it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dr. Wells began, his voice carrying through the speaker system, "tonight we celebrate not just a building but a vision of hope for the thousands of patients who will receive life-saving treatment within these walls. And we owe this vision to 2 extraordinary individuals. First, our own Dr. Richard Mitchell, whose surgical brilliance and dedication to cardiac care have made Boston General a beacon of excellence." Applause erupted. Clara watched Richard stand from his seat at the head table, accepting the adulation with practiced humility. The woman in red touched his arm, and he leaned down to whisper something in her ear that made her laugh. Clara's stomach turned. "And second," Dr. Wells continued, "our generous benefactor, who has asked to remain anonymous, but who I hope will forgive me for extending a personal invitation to join us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Dante Romano." The name meant nothing to Clara, but the reaction in the room was immediate and electric. A murmur swept through the crowd as heads turned toward the back of the ballroom. Clara followed their gazes and felt her breath catch in her throat. He emerged from the shadows near the service entrance, not 10 feet from where she stood. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit his powerful frame like armor. His dark hair was swept back from a face that seemed carved from granite, all sharp angles and controlled intensity. But it was his eyes that held Clara, frozen in place. Storm gray, rimmed with something that looked like ancient sorrow, they swept across the room, with the detachment of a man who had seen too much of the world to be impressed by any of it. For one impossible moment, those eyes found hers. Clara felt the contact like a physical touch, like fingers pressing against her sternum, testing the rhythm of her heart. He held her gaze for 3 seconds, 4, and in that brief eternity, she had the strangest sensation that he was memorizing her face, cataloguing her loneliness, reading the story of her unhappiness in the slight tremor of her lower lip. Then he looked away and continued his path toward the podium, and Clara could breathe again. "Mr. Romano," Dr. Wells said, extending his hand, "on behalf of everyone at Boston General, I cannot thank you enough for your extraordinary generosity." Dante Romano shook the administrator's hand briefly, his expression unchanged. When he spoke, His voice was low and measured, carrying effortlessly, without amplification. I have my reasons for supporting this hospital. Personal reasons. I trust the money will be used wisely. His gaze shifted to Richard Mitchell, and Clara saw something flash in those grey eyes, something that made her husband's confident smile falter almost imperceptibly. I will be watching. The applause that followed was uncertain, tinged with the nervous energy of people who sensed they were in the presence of a predator, but could not identify the threat. Clara watched Dante Romano decline the offered seat at the ET head table, and instead move toward the bar at the far end of the room, where two men in dark suits materialized from nowhere to flank him. It was then that Clara noticed the folder in his hand, a manila folder, unremarkable except for the fact that his grip on it was tight enough to whiten his knuckles. Clara! She flinched at the sound of her name. Richard had appeared beside her, his expression tight with irritation. What are you doing hiding over here? I've been looking everywhere for you. The lie was so transparent that Clara almost laughed. Almost. I've been here the entire time, Richard, right where you left me. Don't start. His jaw clenched. Not tonight. This is important. Important to whom? Richard's eyes flickered toward the head table, where the woman in red was watching them with undisguised curiosity. I need you to sign something. There's been a development with the foundation paperwork. Legal says we need your signature on the amended trust documents before midnight or we lose the tax exemption. Clara frowned. What amended documents? You never mentioned any changes to the foundation. It came up suddenly. Just hospital bureaucracy. Nothing for you to worry about. He produced a pen from his jacket pocket and thrust it toward her along with a stack of papers Clara hadn't noticed him carrying. Sign at the flags. All 3 pages. The papers were dense with legal language, the font small enough to strain Clara's eyes in the dim lighting of the ballroom. She caught phrases. Irrevocable transfer, sole discretion, waiver of claims. Something cold settled in her chest. Richard, I can't sign something I haven't read. For God's sake, Clara. His voice dropped to an angry whisper. Do you have to make everything difficult? It's just formality. The lawyers have reviewed it. I've reviewed it. Just sign the papers so I can get back to our guests. Our guests. As if she had any part in this evening. As if she mattered at all. Clara looked down at the documents in her hands, then up at her husband's impatient face. 12 years. 12 years of being dismissed, diminished, reduced to a footnote in the story of Dr. Richard Mitchell's brilliant career. 12 years of believing that if she just tried harder, loved more, sacrificed enough, he would finally see her. She signed the papers. Richard snatched them from her hand before the ink was dry. Finally. Stay here. Try not to embarrass me. He was gone before she could respond, disappearing into the crowd that parted for him like water around the prow of a ship. Clara stood alone in the shadow of the marble pillar and wondered when, exactly, her life had become this. A ghost at her own husband's party. A signature on papers she didn't understand. A woman so invisible that she might as well not exist at all. You should not have signed those. The voice came from her left, low and quiet, carrying the faint trace of an accent she couldn't place. Clara turned and found herself face to face with Dante Romano. Up close he was even more imposing, not just tall but solid, his presence occupying space in a way that made the air around him feel heavier. His grey eyes studied her with an intensity that should have frightened her but somehow didn't. There was no menace in his gaze, only a strange focused attention, as if she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. Excuse me, Clara managed. The documents your husband gave you, they were not foundation, paperwork. He took a step closer and Clara caught the scent of him, something warm and woodsy that cut through the cloying perfume of the ballroom. I have a copy of the originals. What you signed was a post-nuptial agreement, transferring all community property to his name, and waiving your right to any claim on his assets in the event of divorce. You also signed an affidavit, stating that you have no objection to the dissolution of your marriage. The words didn't make sense. Clara heard them, understood each individual syllable, but their combined meaning refused to assemble in her mind. That's not possible. Richard wouldn't. Richard would. Dante Romano's voice was flat, without emotion. He has been planning this for months. The woman in the red dress is Dr. Sarah Chen, his colleague and his mistress for the past 2 years. He intends to file for divorce tomorrow morning, citing irreconcilable differences and your voluntary relinquishment of marital assets. By this time next week you will have nothing. No home, no money, no legal standing to contest any of it. Because you signed those papers. Clara's legs gave way. She would have fallen if not for the strong hand that caught her elbow, steadying her with surprising gentleness. Through the roaring in her ears, she heard Dante Romano's voice continue, calm and inexorable. I am telling you this because you deserve to know, and because what happens next is your choice, not his. Why? The word emerged as a whisper. Why would you? How do you even know any of this? Something flickered in those storm-grey eyes. Pain, perhaps, or recognition. Because 15 years ago, I watched my sister die on an operating table in this hospital. The surgeon who should have saved her was too busy covering up his affair to notice that her vital signs were crashing. That surgeon was Richard Mitchell, and the woman he was protecting at the cost of my sister's life was his first wife. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Oh, my God. He never faced consequences. The investigation was buried. The hospital protected him. He went on to build his career on the foundation of my sister's death. Dante Romano's jaw tightened. So, yes, Mrs. Mitchell, I have been watching your husband for a very long time, and I have been waiting for the right moment to destroy him. The ballroom spun around Clara. She was vaguely aware of the laughter and music continuing as if nothing had changed, as if her entire world hadn't just collapsed in the space of a conversation. She looked across the room at Richard, at the easy smile on his face, at the casual way he touched Sarah Chen's arm, and felt something inside her shift from despair to cold, crystalline clarity. What do I do? She asked. Dante Romano studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached into his jacket and produced the manila folder he had been carrying. First, you read this. It contains everything. The original documents, the evidence of your husband's affair, the medical records from my sister's case, and the testimony of 3 nurses who were paid to keep quiet. Then, if you choose, you come with me. My lawyers are waiting. We can file an emergency motion to void the documents you signed on the grounds of fraud and coercion. By morning, Richard Mitchell will be facing not only the end of his marriage, but the end of his career. Clara took the folder with trembling hands. And what do you get out of this? Justice. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with 15 years of grief, and perhaps the chance to help someone else survive what I could not. He stepped back, giving her space, giving her choice. In his face, Clara saw no manipulation, no ulterior motive, only the tired resignation of a man who had carried hatred for so long that it had become part of his skeleton. My car is parked in the east garage, level 3, he said quietly. Black sedan. If you decide you want to fight, I will be there for the key. Next 30 minutes. After that I will pursue Richard Mitchell through other means and you will be on your own. He paused. I hope you choose to fight, Mrs. Mitchell, for your sake, not mine. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Clara alone with a folder full of secrets and a choice that would define the rest of her life. She stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching the party continue around her like a television show with the sound turned off. Richard was at the podium now, accepting some award, his voice carrying through the speakers in smooth, practiced cadences. Sarah Chen applauded from the front row, her red dress catching the light like a flame. Clara looked down at the folder in her hands. Then she turned and walked toward the east garage. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. This is where stories begin that you will never forget. Subscribe now, so you never miss a moment. The parking garage was cold and echoing, a stark contrast to the warmth of the ballroom above. Clara's heels clicked against the concrete as she made her way to level 3, each step feeling like a decision, a commitment, a door closing behind her that she might never be able to open again. The black sedan was exactly where Dante Romano had said it would be, parked in a corner space away from the security cameras. As Clara approached, the rear door opened, and she caught a glimpse of warm leather interior and the soft glow of reading lights. "Mrs. Mitchell," Dante's voice emerged from the darkness. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't come." Clara stopped at the edge of the light. "I almost didn't. Standing up there, watching Richard accept another award, listening to everyone talk about what a great man he is. Part of me wanted to go back inside and pretend none of this ever happened." "And the other part?" "The other part remembered that I've been pretending for 12 years. Clara took a deep breath. "I don't want to pretend anymore." She climbed into the car. The interior smelled like expensive leather and the same warm, woodsy scent she had noticed on Dante earlier. He sat across from her in the spacious back seat, his grey eyes reflecting the dim lighting like pools of mercury. "My team is expecting us," he said, as the driver pulled smoothly out of the parking space. "There is a lot of work to do before morning." "Your team?" "Lawyers, accountants, people who specialize in complicated situations." The ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Running a business empire requires a certain flexibility with conventional methods." Clara should have been alarmed by the implication. She should have asked questions, demanded clarifications, insisted on knowing exactly what she was getting herself into. Instead, she opened the folder in her lap and began to read. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of documents, photographs, and recorded testimonies. Clara learned that Richard's affair with Sarah Chen had begun shortly after she joined the hospital staff, facilitated by late nights in his office and conferences where Clara was never invited. She learned that the post-nuptial agreement she had signed was the work of a lawyer with a history of ethical violations, drafted specifically to be as one-sided as legally possible. She learned that Richard had been siphoning money from their joint accounts into a private trust for the past 18 months, preparing for a divorce that he had been planning long before he ever mentioned it to her. And she learned about Dante Romano's sister. Isabella Romano had been 23 years old when she came to Boston General with chest pain and shortness of breath. She was a nursing student, healthy, active, with her whole life ahead of her. The diagnosis was a congenital heart defect that had gone undetected for years, serious but treatable with surgery. Richard Mitchell was assigned as her surgeon, considered one of the best young cardiac specialists in the country. But on the day of Isabella's surgery, Richard was distracted. His affair with his first wife's best friend had been discovered, and he spent the morning on phone calls trying to manage the fallout. He was late to the operating room. He missed warning signs on Isabella's monitors. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was too late. Isabella Romano died on the operating table at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. She was alone. Her brother Dante, who had been waiting in the surgical lounge with flowers and a card congratulating her on surviving the procedure, learned of her death from a nurse who couldn't meet his eyes. The investigation that followed was brief and inconclusive. Richard Mitchell's influential friends in hospital administration ensured that the official report cited unforeseen complications rather than negligence. The nurses who knew the truth were encouraged to find employment elsewhere. Dante Romano, then a young man just beginning to build his fortune, was offered condolences and shown the door. Clara looked up from the documents, her eyes burning with tears. She hadn't realized she was crying. Dante was watching her with an expression that held no expectation, no demand for sympathy or understanding. "I had no idea," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for. You are as much a victim of Richard Mitchell as my sister was." He leaned forward slightly. "The question now is whether you want to be his victim any longer." The car had stopped. Clara looked out the window and saw a brownstone building in what appeared to be Beacon Hill, its windows dark except for one on the second floor. "Where are we?" "A property I own under a different name. Secure. Private. My legal team is inside, along with everything we need to begin proceedings." Dante opened his door but didn't exit. "You can still walk away, Mrs. Mitchell. I will have my driver take you anywhere you wish to go. I will pursue Richard through other channels, and you need never see me again." Clara thought about the house she had shared with Richard for 8 years, the antique furniture and expensive art that she had never chosen and never loved. She thought about the closet full of modest clothes because Richard always said extravagance was unbecoming in a surgeon's wife. She thought about the dreams she had set aside, one by one, until she couldn't remember what they had been. "My name is Clara," she said, "and I'm not walking away." Something shifted in Dante's expression, something that might have been respect or relief or both. He nodded once and stepped out of the car, extending his hand to help her out. The brownstone interior was warm and softly lit, decorated with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and refined taste. A woman in her 50s met them at the door, introducing herself as Margaret Chen, senior partner at a law firm Clara had never heard of, but which apparently specialized in high-stakes divorce and corporate litigation. "Mrs. Mitchell, I've reviewed the documents you signed," Margaret said, leading them into a study lined with law books. "The good news is that they were obtained through clear fraud. Your husband represented them as foundation paperwork, when they were in fact divorce-related documents. That alone is grounds for voidance." "And the bad news?" Clara asked. "The bad news is that Richard Mitchell is well-connected, well-funded, and highly motivated to make this divorce happen on his terms. We need to move quickly and decisively." Margaret spread a series of papers across the desk. "I've prepared emergency motions to freeze all marital assets, void the fraudulent documents, and compel discovery of your husband's financial records. I've also drafted a civil complaint alleging fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional infliction of emotional distress." Clara's head was spinning. "This is all happening so fast." "It has to," Dante spoke. From his position by the window, his silhouette outlined against the city lights. "Richard expects you to be passive. He expects you to wake up tomorrow, realize what you've signed, and accept your fate quietly. The last thing he anticipates is aggressive legal action before he even files his divorce petition." "He knows you," Margaret added gently. "He spent 12 years training you to accept whatever he decides. Our job is to remind him that you are not the woman he thinks you are." Clara looked at the documents on the desk, then at Dante's steady presence by the window, then at her own hands, still trembling but no longer from fear, from something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "Where do I sign?" she asked. The next several hours were consumed by paperwork, strategy sessions, and preparations for the legal storm that would break at dawn. Clara signed legitimate documents this time, each one explained in detail by Margaret and her team. She authorized the freezing of accounts, the filing of motions, the retention of investigators, to document Richard's affair and hidden assets. At some point, someone brought coffee and sandwiches. Clara ate without tasting, drank without registering, her mind cycling through revelations and realizations that kept reshaping her understanding of her entire marriage. Around 3 in the morning, when the lawyers had finally left and the house had settled into quiet, Clara found herself alone with Dante in the study. He had removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, and she could see the edge of a tattoo disappearing beneath his shirt cuff. The informality made him seem more human, more approachable, though no less intense. "You should sleep," he said. "There is a guest room prepared upstairs. Tomorrow will be difficult." "I don't think I can sleep." Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, seeking warmth. "Every time I close my eyes, I see Richard's face. The way he smiled at her. The way he's probably smiled at me 1,000 times while planning all of this." Dante was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the room and sat in the chair across from her, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the evidence of years spent carrying weight that never lightened. "After my sister died," he said slowly, "I did not sleep for 3 weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Not as she was in life, but as she must have been in those final moments. Alone, afraid, wondering why no one was saving her." He paused. "The grief almost destroyed me, but anger saved me. Anger gave me purpose. It gave me the focus to build what I have built, to wait as long as I have waited, to finally be in a position to do something meaningful with my pain. Clara studied his face. Is that what this is for you? Revenge? It was. For 15 years, it was the only thing that kept me moving forward. His grey eyes met hers. But tonight, watching you stand alone in that ballroom, watching him dismiss you as if you were nothing, I realize that destroying Richard Mitchell is not enough. I want to see someone he hurt rise from the ashes of his betrayal and become stronger than he ever allowed her to be. The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning Clara wasn't sure she was ready to examine. She looked away first, her heart beating too fast in her chest. I should try to sleep, she said. Dante nodded and rose. Second door on the right at the top of the stairs. If you need anything, I will be here. Clara paused at the door of the study. Mr. Romano... Dante. Dante. The name felt strange on her tongue, intimate in a way that surprised her. Thank you for telling me the truth, for giving me a choice. He inclined his head slightly. You chose to fight, Clara. Everything else follows from that. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we go to war. Clara climbed the stairs to the guest room and found it warm, softly lit, with fresh sheets on a bed that looked more comfortable than anything in the house she had shared with Richard. She lay down without undressing, staring at the ceiling, her mind still racing through the events of the night. She had walked into that ballroom as Dr. Richard Mitchell's invisible wife. She was leaving it as something else entirely, something she couldn't yet name but could feel taking shape in her chest, like a flame catching on kindling that had been waiting years to burn. Outside the window, the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the Boston sky. Clara closed her eyes and let exhaustion finally claim her, knowing that when she woke, nothing would ever be the same. The morning arrived with watery sunlight and the distant sound of traffic on Beacon Hill's narrow streets. Clara opened her eyes slowly, disoriented for a moment by unfamiliar surroundings, then felt the previous night crash back over her like a wave. She found fresh clothes laid out at the foot of the bed, simple but elegant in her size. A note in precise handwriting read, "Margaret's assistant picked these up. Your husband cannot be allowed to see you in yesterday's dress. The war begins with appearances. D." Clara showered, dressed, and descended the stairs to find the brownstone transformed into a command center. 3 young associates were setting up laptops and printers in the dining room. Margaret Chen was on the phone in rapid conversation, her tone sharp and professional. And Dante stood by the pure window in the study, watching the street below with the stillness of a man accustomed to waiting. "The motions have been filed," he said without turning around. "Emergency hearing scheduled for 9 o'clock. Richard was served at 6 this morning, along with a letter from my attorneys informing him that the anonymous donor to his cardiac wing is now actively pursuing civil action against him for professional negligence resulting in wrongful death." Clara moved to stand beside him. From this angle, she could see the tension in his jaw, the coiled energy of someone finally releasing a burden carried too long. How did he react? "According to my sources, he threw his phone against the wall and called you several dozen times before realizing your number has been changed." A grim smile touched Dante's lips. He then called his lawyer, who informed him that his assets have been frozen pending investigation. He is, as they say, scrambling. Some part of Clara expected to feel satisfaction at this news. Instead, she felt only a hollow ache, the echo of a marriage that had never been what she thought it was. "I keep waiting to feel angry," she said quietly. "I should be angry. He lied to me for 12 years. He was planning to throw me away like I meant nothing." "You meant nothing to him." Dante's voice was gentle despite the harsh words. "That is not a reflection of your worth, Clara. It is a reflection of his emptiness. Some people are incapable of recognizing value. In others, they see only mirrors of their own ambition, and when those mirrors no longer serve them, they discard them." Clara turned to look at him. In the morning light, the severity of his features was softened, revealing a depth of feeling she hadn't noticed in the shadows of the ballroom. How do you know so much about what he's feeling? Because I have made a study of Richard Mitchell for 15 years. Dante finally met her eyes. I know his schedule, his habits, his weaknesses, his secrets. I know the names of every woman he has used and discarded since my sister's death. I know the bribes he has paid, the evidence he has buried, the careers he has destroyed to protect his reputation. He paused. And I know that for all his intelligence and ambition, he has one fatal flaw. He underestimates everyone around him. He underestimated my sister's life. He underestimated my patience. And most critically, he underestimated you. Before Clara could respond, Margaret appeared in the doorway. The car is ready. We need to leave for the courthouse in 10 minutes. The Boston Superior Court was an imposing granite building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered it. Clara walked up the steps between Dante and Margaret, conscious of the cameras that had gathered at the bottom, of the reporters shouting questions she couldn't quite hear. "Word travels fast in this city," Margaret murmured. "Anonymous donor sues famous surgeon" makes for compelling headlines. The courtroom was smaller than Clara had expected, wood-paneled and hushed, with a judge's bench that dominated the space like a throne. Richard was already there, seated at the defendant's table with two lawyers she didn't recognize. He looked up as Clara entered, and the expression on his face shifted rapidly from shock to anger to something that might have been fear. "Clara." He started to rise. "What the hell is going on? Where have you been? Why are you with him?" The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, rapped her gavel. "Dr. Mitchell, you will sit down and address all comments through counsel. This is not the place for personal confrontations." Clara took her seat at the plaintiff's table, her heart pounding but her hands steady. Dante sat in the gallery directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like a shield at her back. The next 2 hours were a blur of legal arguments, evidentiary submissions, and procedural motions. Margaret presented the fraudulent documents Clara had signed, demonstrated their clear deviation from legitimate foundation paperwork, and introduced expert testimony on the psychological manipulation of spouses in long-term marriages. Richard's lawyers objected repeatedly, but the judge's expression grew increasingly grim as the evidence mounted. When the session finally recessed, the judge announced that the emergency motions were granted. All marital assets would remain frozen, pending full investigation. The documents Clara had signed were preliminarily voided pending a formal fraud hearing. Richard Mitchell was prohibited from contacting Clara directly or indirectly, from disposing of any shared property, and from leaving the state until the civil matters were resolved. Clara walked out of the courtroom into a wall of cameras and shouted questions. Dante was suddenly beside her, his hand warm and steady on her elbow, guiding her through the crowd toward a waiting car. She heard fragments of the reporters' questions. "Mrs. Mitchell, is it true your husband falsified medical records? Mr. Romano, are you pursuing criminal charges? Dr. Mitchell, do you have any comment on the allegations of wrongful death?" Then the car door closed, and silence enveloped them. Clara realized she was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of everything that had happened in the past 18 hours. She had walked into a gala as a wife, and was leaving a courthouse as a plaintiff, a victim, a fighter. The transformation was too vast to process, too fundamental to absorb. "You did well," Dante said quietly. "Better than well. You were magnificent." Clara looked at him through eyes blurred with exhaustion and unshed tears. "I don't feel magnificent. I feel like my entire life has been a lie and I'm just now waking up to realize it." "That is exactly how you should feel." He reached across the space between them and, hesitantly, took her hand. His grip was warm, his palm slightly rough, and the contact sent an unexpected current through Clara's nervous system. The awakening is always painful, but it is also the beginning of everything real. They drove in silence through Boston's crowded streets, past landmarks Clara had seen 1,000 times, but which now looked somehow different, charged with possibility. The brownstone welcomed them back with its quiet elegance, its sense of sanctuary that Clara was beginning to associate with safety. "There is food in the kitchen," Dante said as they entered. "Margaret will return this afternoon to discuss next steps. In the meantime, I suggest you rest. The hearing was only the first battle. The war is far from over." Clara nodded, but instead of heading upstairs, she found herself lingering in the study, drawn to the window where Dante had stood that morning. The view overlooked a small garden, dormant now in early spring, but showing the first tentative signs of green. Something about it felt metaphorical, though Clara was too tired to articulate exactly how. "Can I ask you something?" she said without turning around. "Anything. After today, after Richard is dealt with, what happens to us?" The silence stretched long enough that Clara began to regret the question. Then Dante's voice came from closer than she expected, close enough that she could feel his warmth at her back. "I have spent 15 years building toward this moment," he said. "Planning, waiting, preparing. I never allowed myself to imagine what might come after. Revenge was my purpose. Without it—" He trailed off. Clara turned to face him. They were standing closer than she had realized, close enough that she could see the faint silver threads in his dark hair, the tiny scar above his left eyebrow, the vulnerability he kept hidden beneath layers of control. "Maybe that's the real victory," she said softly. "Not destroying Richard, but learning how to live without being defined by what he did to us." Something shifted in Dante's expression, a crack in the armor he wore so instinctively. "You are a remarkable woman, Clara Mitchell." "I don't feel remarkable. I feel scared and confused and completely out of my depth. Those things are not mutually exclusive with remarkable." He lifted his hand, hesitated, then gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You walked into that ballroom invisible and walked out a warrior. You signed papers that should have destroyed you and turned them into weapons. You are sitting in the house of a man you met 12 hours ago, trusting him with your future, because something in you recognized that this was the path you needed to take." His grey eyes held hers. "That is remarkable, Clara. That is courage." Clara felt tears threatening again, but these were different, cleaner somehow, like rain washing away years of accumulated dust. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. "I don't know who I am without being Richard's wife. I've spent so long being what he wanted me to be that I'm not sure I remember who I was before. Then we will find out together." The words emerged from Dante like a vow, quiet but unshakable. "One day at a time, one truth at a time, until you look in the mirror and recognize yourself again." If you're watching this, leave a comment with this sentence: "Sometimes the darkest nights lead us to the brightest stars." I want to know who among you believes in second chances. The days that followed blurred into a rhythm of legal proceedings, strategy sessions, and small moments of unexpected connection. Clara moved into a guest suite at the Brownstone, her temporary home, while her life reassembled itself from the wreckage of her marriage. She learned to navigate the complex web of hearings and depositions, to face Richard across courtroom tables without flinching, to speak her truth to judges and lawyers, and eventually to the press. The story of the anonymous donor and the disgraced surgeon captivated Boston. Reporters dug into Richard's past and found other irregularities, other patients whose outcomes had been quietly buried, other women whose careers had been derailed by his ambition. The hospital administration that had protected him for years began to distance itself. Colleagues who had praised him at the gala suddenly remembered concerns they had never voiced. But it was Dante's civil case that delivered the final blow. Armed with 15 years of evidence, his legal team constructed an airtight argument for professional negligence in Isabella Romano's death. Witnesses who had been paid to stay silent agreed to testify in exchange for immunity. Internal hospital documents, obtained through discovery, revealed a pattern of cover-ups that went far beyond a single case. Richard Mitchell's medical license was suspended pending investigation. His position at Boston General was terminated. His academic appointments were revoked. The cardiac wing that bore his name was quietly renamed the Isabella Romano Center for Cardiac Care, funded by her brother's original donation and dedicated to her memory. Clara watched it all unfold from a curious distance, as if observing the collapse of a structure she had once lived in but no longer recognized as home. She felt no joy in Richard's destruction, only a gradual lightening, as if chains she hadn't known she was wearing were falling away one by one. 3 months after the gala, Clara sat in Dante's study as spring transformed the garden outside the window into a riot of color. She had just returned from signing the final divorce papers, a straightforward process now that Richard had nothing left to fight with. The settlement awarded her half of the legitimate marital assets, plus damages for fraud that would ensure her financial security for years to come. "How do you feel?" Dante asked from his usual position by the fireplace. Clara considered the question. Empty, but in a good way, like a room that's been cleared of clutter. There's space now, space for something new. Have you thought about what that something might be? She had. In the quiet hours of the past 3 months, while lawyers battled and reporters circled and Richard's empire crumbled, Clara had begun to remember the dreams she had set aside when she became a surgeon's wife. She had wanted to teach once. She had wanted to travel. She had wanted to build something meaningful with her own hands rather than supporting someone else's vision. "I want to go back to school," she said. "Finish the degree I abandoned when I married Richard. Maybe teach eventually, maybe write." She smiled slightly. "It sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. I'm 38 years old. Most people my age are established in their careers. Most people your age have not spent 12 years learning the hard way what they do not want." Dante moved closer, sitting in the chair across from her the way he had that first night. "You have time, Clara. You have resources. You have a second chance that most people never receive. Thanks to you." "No." His voice was firm. "Thanks to you. I gave you information. You chose to act on it. I offered resources. You chose to use them. Everything that has happened since that night is the result of your courage, not my interference." Clara looked at him. This man who had entered her life as a stranger with a 15-year vendetta and had become something else entirely. Something she was still learning to define. Over the past 3 months, she had watched him navigate a world of power and danger with quiet authority. She had seen his gentleness with the staff who worked in his home, his generosity with the charities he supported, his patience with her endless questions about his business and his past. And she had felt something growing between them, something neither of them had acknowledged, but which hummed in every conversation, every accidental touch, every moment when their eyes met and held a beat too long. "Dante," she said carefully, "what happens now? To us?" He was silent for a long moment, his grey eyes searching her face. "I have tried very hard not to think about that question," he admitted. "You came to me in crisis. You were vulnerable, dependent on my resources, uncertain of your own worth. It would have been inappropriate for me to—" "I'm not in crisis anymore." Clara leaned forward. "I'm not dependent on you. The divorce is final. The settlement is secured. I have my own apartment, my own money, my own plans for my future." She paused. "And I'm still here." "You are still here," he agreed softly. "I'm still here because I want to be. Not because I need protection or resources or someone to save me. I'm here because, over the past 3 months, I've discovered that you are the most remarkable person I've ever met. You waited 15 years to give your sister justice. You saw a stranger being betrayed and chose to help her when you had nothing to gain. You've been patient and kind, and respectful when you could have taken advantage at any point." Clara reached across the space between them and took his hand. "I'm here because I think I might be falling in love with you, Dante Romano, and I need to know if that's a disaster or a possibility." Dante's hand tightened around hers. Something cracked in his expression, the final layer of armor falling away to reveal the man beneath, bruised by loss, scarred by years of focused hatred, but still capable of feeling, still capable of hope. "It is a possibility," he said, his voice rough. "It has been a possibility since the moment I saw you standing alone in that ballroom, so obviously deserving of more than you were receiving. I told myself it was justice that brought me to you. I told myself I was helping you because it served my vendetta against Richard. But the truth is... Yes? The truth is that I saw you, and I wanted to know you. Not as a victim, not as a tool, but as yourself, Clara. Just Clara. He lifted her, hand to his lips, and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. I have loved you for months, and I was afraid to say it because I did not know if you could ever see me as anything other than the man who destroyed your marriage. You didn't destroy my marriage. Clara moved closer, close enough to feel his breath on her face. Richard destroyed our marriage years ago. You just showed me the truth. The truth is often painful. Yes, but it's also necessary. She smiled. And right now, the truth is that I want you to kiss me, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. Dante's answer was not verbal. He pulled her toward him, one hand cupping her face with exquisite gentleness, and kissed her with all the restrained passion of a man who had waited far too long for something good. Clara melted into him, feeling safety and desire and possibility all tangled together in a way she had never experienced before. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Dante rested his forehead against hers. I should warn you, he murmured. My life is complicated. My business is not entirely legitimate. There are people who would use you against me if they knew you mattered. Do I matter? More than anything has mattered in 15 years. Clara kissed him again, brief but decisive. Then we'll figure it out. Together, one day at a time. The months that followed were an education in a world Clara had never imagined. She learned that Dante Romano's empire stretched across 3 continents, built on a foundation of legitimate businesses layered over operations that existed in grey areas the law preferred not to examine too closely. She met men with scarred knuckles and gentle voices, women with sharp minds and sharper instincts, an entire community bound by loyalty rather than legality. And she learned that Dante, for all his power and reputation, was trying to change. The vendetta against Richard had been his last act of darkness, his final tribute to the anger that had driven him for so long. With that accomplished, with his sister's death finally acknowledged and atoned for, he was pivoting his organization toward legitimate enterprises. It was slow work, complicated by years of established patterns and the resistance of those who benefited from the status quo, but he was committed. Why now? Clara asked one evening, as they sat together in the garden that had become their favorite place. Because of you. Dante pulled her closer against his side. You showed me that it was possible to survive the worst and choose differently, to build instead of destroy, to hope instead of hate. He pressed a kiss to her temple. I do not want to be the man I was when we met. I want to be someone worthy of the woman you are becoming. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind, the kind that came from recognizing grace when it appeared. I love you, Dante. I love you, Clara, more than words can express. 1 year after the gala, they stood together on a terrace overlooking Boston Harbor, surrounded by people who had become family. Margaret Chen, who had transitioned from Clara's lawyer to her friend and mentor. The staff of the brownstone, who had watched Clara transform from a frightened guest to the lady of the house. Representatives from the charitable foundations they had established together, including a scholarship program for nursing students at Boston General. And behind them, in a place of honor, a portrait of Isabella Romano at 23, smiling with all the promise of a life cut short, but finally remembered. 1 year ago today, Dante said to the gathered crowd, I walked into a hospital gala intending to begin the final phase of a revenge I had planned for 15 years. I walked out with something I never expected. A partner, a purpose, a future worth living for. He turned to Clara, his grey eyes bright with emotion. Clara Mitchell showed me that justice is not the same as vengeance, that healing does not require destruction, that the best way to honor those we have lost is to live fully, love deeply, and build something that matters. Clara took his hand, her heart so full she could barely breathe. And Dante Romano showed me that it's never too late to start over, that the truth no matter how painful, is always worth knowing. That strength comes not from never falling, but from choosing to rise every single time. Dante reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. The crowd gasped as he dropped to one knee. "Clara, 1 year ago you signed papers that should have been your destruction, but instead became your liberation. Today I'm asking you to sign something different, something real." He opened the box to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, a single diamond set in white gold. "Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that you made the right choice when you walked into that parking garage?" Clara pulled him to his feet and kissed him soundly, to the cheers and applause of everyone watching. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. 1,000 times yes. The wedding was 6 months later, a small ceremony in the garden of the brownstone, attended only by those who truly mattered. Clara wore white not as a symbol of innocence, but as a declaration of new beginnings. Dante wore a dark suit that matched his eyes, and when he looked at her walking down the aisle, he cried for the first time since his sister's funeral. After the ceremony, after the toasts and the dancing and the quiet moments stolen in corners, Clara stood at the window of the bedroom that was now theirs, looking out at the city she had called home her entire life. "What are you thinking about?" Dante asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "I'm thinking about that woman at the gala, the one who stood alone by the pillar, invisible to everyone, signing papers she didn't understand because she had forgotten she had the right to say no." Clara leaned back into his warmth. "I don't recognize her anymore. It's like she was someone else entirely. She was you, waiting to become who you were meant to be." "Who am I meant to be?" Dante turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "That's not for me to say. But whoever she is, I can't wait to meet her." Clara smiled, a real smile, the kind that came from the deepest part of her being. "Then let's find out together." They did. In the years that followed, Clara finished her degree and began teaching at a community college, sharing her love of literature with students who reminded her of herself at that age, hungry for knowledge and uncertain of their worth. She wrote a book about her experience, a memoir that became a bestseller, inspiring countless others to recognize the signs of manipulation and find the courage to walk away. Dante completed the transformation of his organization, divesting from anything that couldn't withstand legal scrutiny, reinvesting in businesses that created jobs and opportunities rather than exploiting vulnerabilities. He sat on the board of 3 hospitals and funded research into cardiac care that had already saved more lives than his sister's death had cost. Together, they established the Isabella Romano Foundation, dedicated to supporting victims of domestic manipulation and professional negligence. They sponsored legislation requiring clearer disclosure in legal documents. They built a network of support for women who found themselves where Clara had been, standing alone at parties, invisible to the partners who should have cherished them. And they loved each other imperfectly and completely, through challenges and celebrations, through disagreements and reconciliations, through the ordinary days that made up the texture of a life well lived. 5 years after the gala, Clara gave birth to their daughter. They named her Isabella, for the sister who had been lost, but called her Bella, for the beauty she brought into their lives. Dante held her in his arms and wept again, this time from joy so profound it could not be contained. "She has your eyes," Clara said from the hospital bed. "She has your courage." Dante kissed the tiny forehead. "And she will never, ever doubt how much she is loved." Clara reached for his hand and squeezed. "None of us will." The seasons turned. Bella grew from infant to toddler, to a bright, curious child who asked questions about everything and demanded stories every night before bed. Clara told her about princesses who saved themselves, about queens who built kingdoms, about ordinary women who did extraordinary things simply by refusing to accept less than they deserved. And Dante told her about an aunt she would never meet, but whose memory lived on in every act of kindness, every scholarship funded, every life saved by the medical research that bore her name. "Will I be like Aunt Isabella when I grow up?" Bella asked one night. Dante pulled the blankets up to her chin and smiled. "You will be." Like yourself. That's the most anyone can be. But what if myself isn't good enough? Clara, listening from the doorway, felt her heart crack and heal in the same moment. She crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, taking her daughter's small hand. Bella, listen to me. You are already good enough, right now exactly as you are. Nothing you do or don't do can change that. The only person who gets to decide your worth is you. She glanced at Dante, who nodded with tears in his eyes. Your father taught me that a long time ago, and now we're teaching you. Promise me you'll remember. I promise, Mama. 10 years after the gala, Clara stood on the stage of a packed auditorium, accepting an award for her advocacy work. The crowd included senators and celebrities, survivors and supporters, people from every walk of life united by a common belief in second chances. 20 years ago, Clara began, I was a woman who had forgotten how to see herself. I lived in the shadow of someone else's ambition, signed papers without reading them, and believed that love meant disappearing so that someone else could shine. Then one night, a stranger told me the truth, and everything changed. She looked out at the audience and found Dante in the third row, Bella asleep against his shoulder, his grey eyes shining with pride and love. That stranger became my partner, my husband, my family. But the real transformation didn't come from him. It came from the moment I chose to believe. I deserved better. That's what I want you to take away tonight. Not my story, but your own. Whatever you're facing, whatever lies you've been told about your worth, whatever papers you've signed that you wish you could take back, it's not too late. It's never too late to stand up, to speak out, to start again. The applause was thunderous. Clara descended from the stage into Dante's arms, Bella waking just enough to mumble something about being hungry before falling back asleep. You were magnificent, Dante whispered. You always say that. Because it's always true. They walked out of the auditorium into the cool night air, a family forged from pain and rebuilt through love. The city sparkled around them, full of stories unfolding in every window, every street corner, every quiet moment between strangers who might, if fate were kind, become something more. Clara took Dante's hand and squeezed it tight. Take me home, she said, and he did. If you've watched this far, it's because you like this story. Leave a comment saying, I've watched this far so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us create more stories like this one. And if you haven't already, check if you're subscribed to this channel. New stories of hope, courage, and love are waiting for you. Join our family and never miss another moment. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to become who you were meant to be.